have a mic and there's no speakers in the room. The mic is just for the screen. So if you please allow me to start, and you're most welcome to the launch or a launch of the recently published Routledge Handbook of Critical Studies in Whiteness, edited by Shona Hunter and Christi from the Westhuizen. My name is Ulf Engel. I'm with the Institute of African Studies here at Leipzig University. Let me start from the teaser on Routledge's website. This handbook offers a unique decolonial take on the field of critical whiteness studies by historicizing and re-spatialising the study of bodies and identities in the world system of coloniality. Or as one of the reviewers stated, this collection offers at long last the foundation of a generally transnational as well as transdisciplinary conversation about whiteness. Indeed, the editors aim at developing a layered argument to show how whiteness works as a formation, a logic, and an assemblage through which global coloniality is enacted relationally in the interconnection between material, symbolic, and effective. Concurring with Achille Mbembe's opposition to the mythologization of whiteness that all racialized subjects can get lured into, they argue that, quote, there is no such thing as white people, but there are people racial as white, humans caught up in the racializing logics of global colonial forms of subjectification and who are constantly called for the many material, cultural, and effective lures of whiteness. So before we come into the intellectual challenging details of this handbook, let me briefly recap how we planned to do this tonight. I will briefly introduce the four speakers, five, more or less, five-ish. And we'll then hand over to Christi, who will moderate the team that has worked on the handbook before she will give back to me, and then we have a round of discussion here in the room. Let me very briefly introduce our four speakers. Christi van der Westhuizen is currently a guest professor at the Institute of African Studies here at Leipzig. She is an associate professor and senior researcher at the Center for the Advancement of Non-Racialism and Democracy at Nelson Mandela University in Pretoria, South Africa, previously known as PE, and apologies. She holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Cape Town, and we are partners in crime in a research collaboration in the context of the Research Institute on Social Cohesion, where we are working on political populism in South Africa or Southern Africa. Shona Hunter, next to Christi, is reader in the Center for Race, Education and Decoloniality, Leeds Beckett University, UK, where she's also the program director for research degrees. She holds a PhD in social policy. And you may be interested, she's also the founder of White Spaces, a blog and a research network that you can Google with very interesting results. Sarah Heinz joins us from Vienna on the screen. She's a professor of English and Anglophone literatures at the University of Vienna. She holds a PhD in English literature from Mannheim, and her habilitation at the same university was on whiteness in contemporary Irish literature and film. Mark Schmitt is a researcher instructor in British cultural studies at the Technical University Dortmund, Germany. He holds a PhD from Mannheim on the topic of British white trash. And our discussant, Evangelia Kindinger, is a professor of American literature and culture at Humboldt University in Berlin. She holds a PhD in English American studies from Ruhr University Bochum on Greek American return narratives. Over to you, Christi.
Very good to be here with you this evening, and wonderful to see such a great turnout of people to talk today with us about whiteness. I'm really very delighted that we can also launch the handbook here. I'm coming to the end of my visiting professorship, and it's been very interesting to actually look at the world from the vantage point of East Germany, and also if one is looking at whitenesses, some interesting questions that also arise in relation to whiteness, you know, looking at both at Germany and Europe from this vantage point. So I've really enjoyed it, also wonderful conversations with colleagues that have been really very enriching. We I have launched the book online globally, as one does nowadays, and I've also had a couple of in-person launches in South Africa with the African authors and discussants, And it's good to also then, in a sense, have a European launch, one could say, and bring whiteness specifically to, or the discussion, the critical discussion of whiteness to this context. And I really want to say thank you to Sarah Heinz from University of Vienna, who's with us online, and then Mark, that's come in from Dortmund, Liao as our discussant. Thank you so much. And then Shona, of course, my co-editor, my co-partner in crime here. So very good. And thank you to all for hosting us this evening, and to Dr. Ute Riedorf for pulling it all together so wonderfully, as you can see around us, and her team as well. So the Routledge International Handbook of Critical Studies in Whiteness was published last year. We've got a full 28 chapters plus an epilogue. You will see that the book is divided in 6 sections. I'm not going to go into detail, but basically there's a section on onto-epistemologies, which is a kind of a theoretical framing of how to understand the critique of whiteness. Then we look at ideologies that we approach as almost conspiracies, ideological conspiracies in terms of the reproduction of whiteness, how whiteness attaches itself to certain ideologies to reproduce itself. Coloniality is, of course, a very key term in the study of whiteness, intersectionalities, governmentalities, and then lastly, provocations, where we look at some of the more difficult questions that arise when you look at a field like critical whiteness studies. So in my own work, I've been guided by the imperative of looking at the centers of power. In South Africa, we do have a lot of work and really also excellent work, of course, looking more at the margins, one could say, Black people, poor people's position over time in South Africa, and particularly through analysis of class relations, capitalism, and so forth. But I believe that if we want to understand the reproduction of power, we also have to look at the centers of power, whiteness being one, heteronormativity, of course, masculinity, and so forth. In the handbook, we define whiteness as dynamic, shifting, and durable as a form of domination. It works systemically, structurally, institutionally, and also through identities at the level of the subject. Shona and I come at critical whiteness studies as, one could say, friendly critics. We, as you can see from the title, this is not the handbook of critical whiteness studies, but rather critical studies in whiteness. So the idea is to approach this field more expansively. We particularly approach scholars that would not necessarily identify themselves as whiteness scholars, but people who have written critically about race. And we wanted to expand the focus away from the global north and the Anglo focus that we've seen very much in critical whiteness studies as a field over the past 30 odd years, to bring in scholars that are differently located and situated. So particularly scholars of color, whether in the global north or the global south, also specifically also scholars from the global south, and many scholars who are not first language English speakers. So really trying to decenter, one could say, the field itself. So for us, it's important to engage in scholarship that is relevant, that addresses current complexities and conundrums and so on. So particularly part of what we're looking at also in our chapter is at, one could say, a newly hyper-visibilized whiteness. And this, of course, we see in the upsurge of nationalisms across the globe, frequently in populist form. I think the most spectacular version of this was the attack on Capitol Hill in the United States 2 years ago. We can definitely talk about how should we understand Bolsonaro supporters storming government buildings now the past few days, which seems like a total copycat action. So for us, when studying the global racial order, it's important to historicize, to not make the mistake of saying, well, it's always been the same, when sometimes you hear this kind of discourse, nothing has changed, things are exactly the same as before, and so forth. We believe if you historicize racial relations, one can see that things have changed. And with regards to race, really due to effective global anti-racist activism. So I think one has to give recognition to the concerted feminist, anti-slavery, anti-colonial, anti-racist, and queer struggles of the past, how many centuries, that have been confronting forms of domination and oppression and oppressive forms of power within and also across states. So we think that what's happening with whiteness now, it's in a kind of a fight back kind of mode. We've got a chapter in the book written by Colleen Boucher and Cheryl Matthias, where they talk about an emboldened whiteness that is basically trying to reassert itself. It wants to claim the national body politic in various countries as white. It wants to purify the nation of what it sees as foreign objects, whether external or internal others. We've got a chapter on hating Meghan Markle, which might sound at first like a frivolous exercise, but in fact, if you, in this analysis, you bring post-feminism in relation to white nationalism, and you see this, how the case of what's going on with the British royal family is very much a metaphor for this attempt to purify the nation, or to return the nation to some version of whiteness. So, so there's a sense of racialized others as invaders that are infecting the white nation and diverting it from its culturally ordained or scientifically verified course of superiority and domination. And so we see also a discourse around others that are internal to whiteness, particularly feminists, queers, anti-racists, and so on, that are deemed to be weakening, in a sense, the white nation from within. These are enemies within that have to be expelled. If we see it, if we look at the reaction against critical race theory, for example, so-called wokeness, etc., etc. Just to take a step back, a formative work in critical whiteness studies has been on the whole notion of whiteness as invisible to white people, that white people themselves do not understand or cannot see the psychological and material effects of racism. And there's an invisibility of these effects of racism to whiteness, and that serves then as a basis for white ignorance, which then serves as a basis for the claim of a white innocence. So I can't go into the detail right now, but we analyze this as a kind of invisibility, ignorance, innocence triad, but we find that while this was how it's functional in more liberal politics, currently is being augmented or even displaced by this basically a white supremacism that reminds one a lot of colonial expressions, actually. Just to finish off from my side, the part of trying to understand whiteness then is, on the one hand, these kinds of processes that I've been describing around a kind of a purification drive, a reclaiming of the nation as white, and so forth. And then on the second hand, or the other hand rather, we want to also understand what is happening internally to whiteness. And a very useful way of understanding whiteness is to also see how it operates in the plural, how it arranges itself within boundaries that are continuously adapted according to the vagaries of power. And in this sense, you have these shifting positions of, one could say, lesser whites within whiteness. Historically, of course, this would refer to Jewish people, Irish people, Italian whites, and so forth in South Africa to Afrikaner whites. Also, the class dimension, Mark's work, for example, on white trash, the notion of poor whites as just about white, or in some cases not really seen as completely white. So you have this internal hierarchical differentiation of multiple whitenesses, and you see socioeconomic realities due to the form, if we think of whether you want to call it neoliberal capitalism or late capitalism, so the form that capitalism has taken and the kinds of socioeconomic deprivations that are being caused. And this is actually serving now as an intra-white point of friction. One way of understanding these resurgent whitenesses as a kind of a renewed investment in whiteness. So you see a kind of a clamoring in terms of racial identification to reclaim whiteness on behalf of those who are positioned as lesser whites. Therefore, a kind of a shift from a class struggle to a race struggle, in which your white economic elites are seeking to mobilize lesser whites with ethnic and cultural markers and in service of whiteness to prevent interracial class alliances from forming, for example, with immigrant minorities. So you see a kind of a reinstatement then of whiteness and of people who are finding themselves on the margins of whiteness, wanting to reclaim whiteness and the privilege and also particularly the access to resources that they hope that will bring to themselves. So let me end on this note. Swiftly hand over to Shona, who will share more with us on the chapter that we've co-written in the handbook.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Christi. Okay, so thank you for inviting me, wherever everybody who's been involved in that is. I can't see your yeah, this is just really nice to be here. By way of a bit of an apology, I'm a bit throaty and a bit coughing and trying to stop doing that. So partly because of that, and also partly because my brain works in one of those traditional academic ways where it makes so many links it kind of collapses halfway through. I'm going to read you some bits from the chapter that are going to speak to the two key points that I wanted to talk about. But as I was listening to Christi, and always when I'm thinking about how we work together, the complementarity is so interesting, because I suppose I've spent my career really critiquing liberal benevolence, which may well sound kind of a very different position from where Christi sits in terms of that consideration of power from the South African point of view. But of course, it's not. They're totally imbricated. And really, this is part of, I think, where my starting point is for today and what I wanted to draw out in relation to the chapter in particular, but the volume as a whole. So hopefully, Christi will let me read everything I need to. But the two key points that I want to draw out then is that whiteness can't be understood from a global Northwest vantage point alone. Coloniality can only, because coloniality cannot be understood from the vantage point of the global Northwest. So Christi's already talked about these multiplicities. So we're talking about colonialities through time, but also coterminously operating at the same point. And the relation between whiteness and coloniality is, for me and for both of us, central to the perspective that we're adopting in the handbook. And it's not necessarily central to the perspective of a lot of people who are critiquing, engaging with and thinking about explicitly about whiteness. And I think that's really important. That is the thing that's important for me, I suppose. So colonization then isn't one implication of liberalism from that point of view. So for me, as somebody who's interested in states and the enactment of states, I'm very interested in liberalism as a lived kind of way of being. But liberalism is established through coloniality. So they're totally, imbricated and entangled. And therefore, whiteness is the enactment of a certain humanity which sustains liberalism. And whiteness there not necessarily as something that's only embodied. So that's what I want to unpack a little bit through reading from our chapter. So it puts people in a racial relation, liberalism, whether it announces that or whether it doesn't. That's its central kind of force. So the central ideas of liberalism then, bureaucracies, institutions and state are white. The second kind of point that leads on from that, then, this first point leads us to understanding something crucial about bodies, identities and subjectivities in a world system. Subjectification through a world system and how we understand that is fundamentally related to liberalism. And this then is fundamental to how we understand whiteness as something that's embodied, actually as a distraction from the enactment of white power, I think often. So subjectification then is materially, affectively and symbolically, dynamically constituted and enacted, that is, as lived in relation, as not ontic. So part of our critique and the ontoepistemology section, the theory section, if you like, of the handbook talks about ontoepistemologies. So we are bringing ontologies and epistemologies into a fundamental relation, and that's the theoretical basis, the meta-theoretical basis for the handbook. Am I okay to do my 3 readings now to elaborate? They're little. So this comes from these three kind of readings elaborate on those two central points, and they come from our chapter. So I'm just going to start and we'll see how we go. So we offer a decolonial analysis true to the praxis as well as the title, by way of first showing how the deconstructionist impulse of whiteness, this deconstructionist impulse in relation to whiteness, must translate into an onto-epistemic struggle, which recognises and refuses race as the way of organising and defining the human. This refusal is in concurrence with Mbembe's opposition to the mythologization of whiteness that all racialized subjects can get lured into. And we've already heard that direct quote, but it's worth reading again. Whiteness is at its best when it turns into a myth. It is the most corrosive and the most lethal when it makes us believe that it is everywhere, that everything originates from it and it has no outside. So we proceed by developing a layered argument to show how whiteness works as a formation, as a logic, and as an assemblage through which global coloniality is enacted relationally. So that's this coterminant, and of course it's a multiple set of relations in the interconnection between the material, the symbolic, and the affective. So from this point of view, there is no such thing as white people, but there are people racialized as white, humans caught up in the racializing logics of global colonial forms of subjectification and who are constantly called to the many material, cultural and affective laws of whiteness. Whiteness falsely promises self-understanding, and this is really fundamental for the 2 points I want to make through the chapter in a moment. So whiteness falsely promises self-understanding and certainty in existence, because this self-understanding can only ever be achieved through the perpetuation of violence on the self and other, because of the mastery which is demanded through a commitment to the idea of race. So being committed to the idea of whiteness commits us to the idea of race and vice versa. And in fact, I would probably prioritise, if I were pushed to the commitment of whiteness, prioritise it, kind of feeds the commitment to race and then produces racism. So it's a complete contraire, if you like, of how we often understand and imagine whiteness to be produced. So 2 minutes, brilliant. Okay, so no, it's fine. You don't believe me. Christi never believes me. Okay, so we do lots of things in the chapter. We analyse some of the dynamics in South Africa, lots of institutional dynamics, think about the moment that we were writing, the murder of George Floyd and all of that sort of stuff. But we also then think about the ways in which the key terms of critical whiteness studies, and that's deliberately critical whiteness studies as this academic formation, if it can be such a thing, have been framed more recently through these ideas of fragility. And so Robin DiAngelo's work is one example of that, but which has been taken up, and we might want to talk about why that's been taken up in particular. But so I just want to read how we differ in relation to that. So I might end up with 3 minutes. Let's see how long it goes. But so DiAngelo suggests through her ideas of fragility that the loss of power is what is feared by white people, but without understanding the relationship of this loss of power to vulnerability. So one of the authors that we use in this chapter, and that is used by other people in the handbook, is George Yancey. So George Yancey, on the other hand, is crystal clear about this link, and the fact that terror and pain, and the fact that the terror and pain provoked at the risk of losing power as a form of domination is about the exposure to the self as vulnerable, as fundamentally unfinished, as only ever in relation, as always, this is from him directly, already beyond ourselves, dispossessed by forces of interpolation, where the idea of automatic self-mastery is deeply problematic. The key to rehumanizing through whiteness, which is something that we elaborate on in the chapter, is coming to realize that the white subject was never the site of mastery in the first place. By attempting to practice livedness outside of this aspiration to mastery, a different orientation to the white body might be possible. This unsuturing, again, that comes from Yancey, and we unpack that a little in relation to our own thinking, is not about returning whiteness and white subjects to comfort or innocence. Instead, the contrary, this unsuturing relates to remaining open to the threat and pain that potentially produces change, because the recognition of subjective vulnerability implies the resistance to the idea of human self-determination. So not just white self-determination, but human self-determination. It places whiteness and whitened subjects in their fullest responsibility with themselves and others. This relationality also disrupts the idea of change as coming from within the white body. Social change is not in the gift of the white master, but achieved through a relationality where subjectivity is enacted by, at the very least, both in relation. Now, I probably haven't got time, so I'm guessing I can read Christi's body language well. But so what we do is we think about how we can understand that form of relationality through the fractured locus, and we engage with Maria Lugones's work and various other bits to help us do that. But that's very important because she has a particular understanding of coloniality and the colonial relation, which aligns with our point of view. So I'm going to leave it there, and I didn't get to read my favourite bit, but I'm sure Christi would have loved.
Thanks, Shona, but we can revisit.
Yes, I know.
So let's hand over to Sarah in Vienna.
Yeah. It's lovely to at least virtually be with you. Thanks for the invitation and for making this technically possible. My chapter was entitled Making Yourself at Home, Performances of Whiteness in Cultural Production about Home and Homemaking Practices. And this chapter grew out of my interest in notions of home and the role of homemaking practices, especially for the creation and naturalization of specific forms of subjectivity and community. Home is where we are made, I assumed, but home is also something that we make in sometimes mundane and unacknowledged acts every single day. At the same time, I argued that home is an oratic term. It glows, it promises something, and it connects people with their past and the people they love. So these acts of making home and of being made as selves within a home are widely circulated within cultural context as something dear to us, something to cherish and to defend. Home is seen as a space where a person can be themselves, or as a participant of a workshop once phrased it, home is where the dog licks my face. It is this connection between imaginaries of home, the materialities of home, specifically property, and notions of whiteness that I was interested in my chapter. Despite its alleged stability and naturalness, whiteness is not a fixed identity, as Shona and Christi already pointed out, but rather something we do and perform. This doing is not simply the choice of each individual. A dispositif of whiteness disposes us towards some rather than other practices, norms, and ideals, and we therefore do whiteness within institutionalized frameworks that are part of larger structures like the state, as well as part of smaller institutions like the family. Exactly because whiteness is in constant need of affirmation through repetition, everyday practices and material contexts like buildings form the basis of people's performances of whiteness. The family home is a prime setting for such performances. Although mostly thought of as a private space, home is intensely political and shaped by normative conventions, economic frameworks, and social expectations. It thus becomes a focal point for whitely practices and is configured by the normative position that whiteness has taken up in Western discourses. In my chapter, I analyzed cultural production surrounding home, specifically property-themed television shows and media about home improvement, to track how exactly practices of doing home and doing whiteness intersect. Asking how a good home is presented and who is or is not eligible for such a good home makes it possible to uncover normative notions of the white subject and its agency that underlie Western ideals and practices of home and homemaking. Our politics, therefore, literally find a home in our houses, apartments, and other dwellings, and they do so in the practices that are part of homemaking routines. These politics of home are all the more important to scrutinize when we consider imaginaries of home in many Western cultures. The term home conjures up a host of associations such as family, comfort, or safety. Of course, meanings of home are dependent on concrete social, cultural, and historical contexts and can differ widely in individual experiences. In addition, home can be a site of negative feelings, exclusion, a loss of self, or even violence, especially for women. Nevertheless, across many Western cultures since the 18th century, home has remained an often idealized, even romanticized setting for the self and for communal ties, for nostalgia, Heimat, and Heimweh. These imaginaries of home take on material form, creating spaces in which we do home every day. In that sense, home can be a very wide space. However, what is seen as good design, proper ways of living, and properly relating to people within a home is intensely regulated and based on the normalization of some forms of behavior and community rather than others. Here, it is specifically salient that many, if not most, homemaking practices seen as good, normal, and proper in contemporary Western society are connected to middle-class whiteness. From the way I'm expected to park my car, prepare and consume food, to the more complex matters of caring for my child, personal hygiene and sexual relations, or more communal matters like entertaining guests in my house, whiteley scripts configure the practices that turn a house into a good or ideal home. Now I want to finish with a few words on my material. Taking these conceptualizations of home and subjectivity as my starting point, I looked at notions of property and material relations. Here I looked into definitions of property as private, individual property, and how such a definition normalizes white subjectivity and Western notions of property law, for example, in settler colonial societies. I then used cultural production on home improvement, DIY, and interior design to assess how property, home, and whiteness are not only linked economically, politically, and legally, but also ontologically in producing and maintaining a sense of self for the inhabitants of a home. In discourses on home improvement, home does not only give shelter to a person, but is an extension of a person's mood, personality, and implicitly their self-regulation and their relations with the outside world. In my media examples, I zoomed in on the therapeutic tone of television shows about renovation, home organization, and buying a home. All these shows take on the character of an intervention, rescuing the houses as much as their inhabitants from crumbling building fabric and their less than ideal homemaking practices. And a lot of this is about tidying up. Episodes typically use editing techniques of before and after to effectively contrast the shocking initial conditions of houses and interiors with the bright and orderly spaces after the experts are done. Tearful homeowners are repeatedly shown thanking the show host for their new lives and a happy end that they had been unable to achieve themselves. Here, home improvement becomes a route towards a better life along the lines of a dispositif of whiteness connected to control, enterprise, and responsibility. And I think that very nicely links with Shona's ideas on liberalism. In a final step, I then linked these discourses on ideal homes to the ideal of being a home owner, bringing the connection between home property and white subjectivity full circle. The white possessive logic at the basis of settler colonies also forms the foundation for a white sense of self-possession, agency, and self-worth that valorizes a subject that owns, that is, that maintains and regulates itself, its bodily urges, and its environments. Cultural production about the home as property or as a space to improve is therefore a highly interesting source of how whiteness is supposed to be done. Just as the homes presented on television or in glossy lifestyle magazines, whiteness becomes a lifelong DIY project for the enterprising, self-improving subject. So we are indeed making ourselves at home, and my chapter explores why it is worthwhile investigating the enduring effects of whiteness and its normalization within these practices of home. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Mark? Over to you.
Yeah, so my contribution to the book is titled, What Do Cultural Figurations Know About Global Whiteness? And the aim of this chapter is to show how cultural figurations of racial identities and of whiteness are an integral part of the social imaginary. That is, they are part of the symbolic and material processes of identity making and of meaning making. Readers, audiences, and fans engage with these figurations in meaningful ways that structure their perception of their own and others' racial identities. In other words, cultural figurations reflect and produce knowledge of whiteness and of ethnicity in general. They therefore contribute to a culture's racial epistemology, or the question of how we can know ourselves and others as racialized. So it's a fundamentally epistemological issue. I consider art and cultural representations as a diverse set of signifying practices that are at the same time inherently social practices. And my proposal in this chapter, therefore, was to look at cultural representations, not just as representations of a given pretextual reality that we can study empirically, but to look at how figurations in a more complex way go beyond this conventional notion of representation, in that they more organically relate to the material and symbolic practices in society, extra-textually more generally. I use this concept of figuration as an epistemological frame by drawing on sociological theories by scholars like John Hartigan, Imogen Tyler, but also literary studies scholars like Barbara Korte, and my own analysis of figurations of tainted whiteness in my book on British white trash in contemporary British novels. This approach bridges the gap between the disciplines of sociology and of literary and cultural studies to comprehensively assess how figurations of whiteness or whitenesses in the plural sense form a wide-ranging social imaginary that must not be merely regarded as fictional representations, but indeed interacting with our empirical world, right? And how we know the world and how we know ourselves. My approach is also fundamentally indebted to work by the African-American writer Toni Morrison, and more recently the Black British writer Rene Eddo-Lodge, who have both discussed the invisibility thesis, which means that whiteness is very often in Western cultural representations the unsaid norm, right? And it's invisible and therefore unmarked as a racial identity. So for example, in Playing in the Dark, her essay collection about whiteness in the literary imagination, Toni Morrison says about the central character in a text by Ernest Hemingway, To Have and Have Not, to quote, "Eddie is white and we know he is because nobody says so." So for her, basically the assumption is that whenever a character is explicitly mentioned as racialized, then usually that character is non-white, right? Rene Eddo-Lodge more recently remembers her experience of reading J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter novels as a young kid growing up in Britain as a Black girl. And she says about this in her book, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race, to quote, "After 4-year-old me came to terms with the fact that I would never turn white, I found refuge in white fictional British and American characters that I could relate to. For so long, that fictional heroic character, loved by so many, has been assumed to be white because whiteness has been assumed to be universal. It is in film, television, and books that we see the most potent manifestations of white as the default assumption. A character simply cannot be Black without a pre-warning for an assumed white audience. Black characters are considered to be unrelatable, with the exception of a handful of high-profile crossover Black Hollywood stars." So that is Rene Eddo-Lodge's assessment of this, of her own relationship with cultural texts and the figurations of whiteness in these texts. More recently, in an American film by the director Nikiatu Yusu called Nanny, which came out last year, 2022. The director mentions in interviews that she had to retrain her white male editors for the film to not always cut to the reaction shot of the white face, but constantly had to remember the editors that the central character of her narrative was a Black woman, and that therefore she should be at the center of every shot, rather than the reactions of white people to her. So in my chapter, I then focus on examples of invisible and hypervisible whiteness, especially in the James Bond franchise. James Bond is an important area to study whiteness because you can consider the James Bond franchise as an afterthought to British imperialism. The franchise and the figure of James Bond are to this very day rooted in the racial matrix of the British Empire. It would not be possible without the notion of British imperial whiteness. Producers and audiences of Avenue films and spin-off novels can convince themselves that really the franchise is colorblind only for so long. When during a 2015 debate, a controversy came up when it was debated that the British Black actor Idris Elba could potentially be the next James Bond after Daniel Craig leaves the franchise. The guardians of the franchise objected to this and said that, like, for example, Roger Moore, the actor who famously played James Bond throughout the 70s and 80s, said that, well, Idris Elba is a fine actor, but he should not be James Bond because James Bond should be English. By that he meant, obviously, that he shouldn't be Black. And, you know, other commentators responded to this as well and said that maybe Idris Elba is a bit too street to be James Bond, right? So even if a Black actor was to play James Bond, it should not be Idris Elba. So there were these racialized assumptions about Idris Elba's credentials to be able to play James Bond. So to wrap this all up, basically what is put into question is that, you know, whiteness is this invisible norm in cultural representations of that kind up to a certain point. And in the very moment, as Renee Edo-Lodge says, you know, the possibility of a non-white actor playing James Bond, for example, suddenly whiteness becomes something that is precarious and needs to be guarded in these kinds of representations. And you can see that audiences and producers have an effective attachment to preserving a certain notion of white knowledge and identity in these characters and figures. All right.
Great. Thank you so much. Over to Leah. So Leah is our discussant this evening, and yeah, looking forward. Thanks.
I am a discussant. It's a bit odd because I mean, I will say something about your book, and you put so much time and energy and effort and everything in it. So it's an interesting situation. But thank you for inviting me to comment and to discuss. So I do come from an American studies perspective, which is actually what I don't like about myself. Because if you want to talk about whiteness, and I very much agree with your approach here, is we need to get away from this centrality of the global north, especially of the UK and the US in critical whiteness studies. But here I am. So I will try to do both more of an outside look, but also look at specific chapters. So actually, when I received the book, I think I was very frustrated with being somebody who studies whiteness as a job, next to being a white person myself. When I read the book, I was thinking a lot about maybe the future of the field, if we want to call critical whiteness studies a field. I certainly do. So where does critical whiteness studies go to? What is happening? And your book actually offered answers that I will explain in a moment. So I think mainly it is very impressive in its scope and aim, 28 chapters, an epilogue. It shows so many different perspectives. And you said the relationality of whiteness, definitely, but also showing unexpected relations. So ideally, you want to learn when you read a book. Yeah, and I know that's a very simple way to start, but I learned a lot. So I learned about, and I'm going to quote authors while I'm offering my comments. So I learned a lot about the relationship between contemporary white nationalism and Hindu nationalism in the Indian American diaspora, as Sitara Tobani mentions in their contribution, or, for example, the maintenance of a desirability of whiteness in reproductive tourism, as shown by Amrita Pandey in their chapter. And you write in your introduction that whiteness, and I'm quoting you too, is a deeply material matter which must be worked through. And the book really works through it through post-colonial theory, the study of visual media, as we just heard from Zara and Mark, but also the study of literature and art, feminism, post-feminism, sociology, philosophy, gender, and also the study of history. And while, Christi, you said that there is change that we need to talk about, I thought it was interesting that the book also shows a continuity in the creation of whiteness in different times and also in different places. And there, it spans centuries. So one of the chapters discusses the 16th century writings of Dutch merchant van Linschoten about Goa. And the author, Arun Saldana, writes that Goa is an apt place to start thinking about the emergence of a European will to dominate the entire globe. And then the book spans to the very contemporary times, and we have contributions that are clearly influenced by the times they were produced in. So by the Black Lives Matter protests after the murder of George Floyd, but then also the fatal effects of the COVID-19 pandemic for particularly people of color around the world, and the ways in which the pandemic once more laid bare the inequalities and hierarchies of power that harm them while protecting rights. So we have a very rich scholarship in this book with very different approaches to whiteness. And I'm just quoting different authors and how they approach whiteness as a social relation, an identity, an ideology, as property, an unspoken presence that ties into the invisibility discourse, an effect of social relations that are structured by inequality and hierarchies of power, and a location of structural advantage. So this is kind of what the book does. Now, what it did to me and what I went away with after I read it is that what really struck me was the self-reflexivity that many authors, and also you in your introductory chapter, showed about critical whiteness studies itself. So critical whiteness studies emerged in the 1990s. And from what I gather, particularly from part 6 in your book that is called Provocations, is that critical whiteness studies is a bit stuck. And that's also the position that I had when I started reading the handbook, is that it's kind of stuck in some of the discourses that originated in the 90s, namely the marked, unmarked dichotomy. Mark, you just mentioned that, the invisibility of whiteness that only works for those who actually possess whiteness, yeah? And in critical whiteness studies, still in the 2010s, many of the work was just showing whiteness, making it visible, and that is really not enough. So this discourse from the 90s, US American scholars Franz Windens Twine and Charles Gallagher have termed this the second wave of critical whiteness studies and situated the first wave in the US in W.E.B. Du Bois's writing. So that's 1920s, 1910s. So this second wave of the 90s didn't really evolve. And one thing that I noticed particularly is that many chapters in the book address whiteness also as a performance, the performativity of whiteness. And in your chapter, Viral Whiteness, and I don't know whether that's the part that you wanted to read, but talking about fragility and also talking about privilege, which is one of the other keywords in critical whiteness studies that we address, criticize, act with, is that very often whiteness is performed in a way that makes it innocence. And it's kind of stuck in a confession of fragility and privilege, and that often results not in anti-racist work, but merely in a performative admittance to fragility and privilege to make one feel innocent, maybe. If I got it right, you named this hand-wringing whiteness in your chapter that is somehow a desperate awakening to one's own whiteness, that then ends up in this performance of, I am a good white person, but that very often does not end in anti-racist work. And to reference what Zara said before, these are also ways of doing whiteness. And I think they very much speak to this maybe backlash that you referenced in your comments. So next to this performativity and self-reflexivity, I mean, the book is published as a Routledge International Handbook, but sometimes that doesn't hold up. But in this case, this is really a very international book. So you write in your preface that the pursuit of anti-racism must be simultaneously intellectual and activist. And you have authors who come from both, well, they're all often connected, but both intellectual and activist works. So what also became clear to me is that next to being intellectual and activist, critical whiteness studies must also be international. So in 2017, critical whiteness studies scholar Steve Garner pointed out that the field often ends up centering white people's lives and losing sight of the impacts whiteness has on those of people of color. And he called for intersectional analysis and international analysis that would pave the future of the field. And the handbook, I think, is one of the most comprehensive collection of international work in whiteness, with a large focus on work from the global South and by scholars of color, as you pointed out, Christi. So there is transdisciplinary scholarship from and about Africa, particularly South Africa and Zimbabwe, India, Israel, the UK, the United States, Germany, Sweden, and Japan. So the study of critical whiteness in the future must be self-reflective, it must be international, it must be concerned with the performative aspect, but it must also be transnational, which is not the same as international. So I think, Zara, you didn't really mention all the different shows you write about in your chapter, but in your contribution, the doing whiteness is happening in almost the same way across the UK, Germany, South Africa, and Asia. So across very different cultures that are nevertheless united by a middle-class ideal of property that is rooted in whiteness. So the last point that really was crucial for me while reading the handbook is the doing aspect. That very much ties in with your work on James Bond, and there are rumors about a new one, and he is of course white and quite young, so we might want to talk about this. So the doing of whiteness is crucial because, Mark, you write in your chapter, the performative aspect of how identities are figured across different spheres and discourses helps us understand the creation of whiteness. And every figuration or every doing of whiteness, and I think the book is doing as well, is shaped and shapes whiteness by itself. So the three things that really stood out to me when reading the handbook, next to the depth and the width, that's a really odd word, but you know what I mean, that the authors, the contributors, and the chapters display is really that you do question critical whiteness studies from within, and I think that's desperately necessary, that you make visible the performativity aspect of whiteness, and that you stress this international and transnational scope that hopefully will help advance the field into a direction in which it will be productive in real life. That's my comment or comment. Thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that. I really appreciate your observations. It's good to know that what one sets out to do has been communicated across. We thought that we would have perhaps a bit of a controversial kind of reception, one could say. Not everybody loves it when you critique a field, but we also wanted to come in such a way that it's actually productive rather than simply just a destructive kind of critique that one unfortunately also finds in academia a lot of the time. So we really wanted to do something productive with it. And our authors, of course, were wonderful in making that possible for us. But I'm going to let myself be led by Ulf, because we may want to bring in our
Yes, we're good for 10 minutes.
Is it? Okay. All right. Good. I think it's worked out very well to have both Sarah and Mark here, because I'm seeing very nice connecting points around the kind of the knowledges that produce whiteness. And something that you haven't mentioned specifically is consumerism, you know, in the construction of white identity, which I think is something that, if one is in the European context trying to make sense of it, is quite useful. In South Africa, we've started to look a bit in the direction of consumption and consumerism generally to try and understand particular kind of enactment of, what would one call it? I mean, it is a kind of a desire of a certain kind of way of being in the world, which neoliberalism or neoliberal capitalism specifically also facilitates. So I wanted to just allow Mark and Sarah to comment on each other's chapters in relation to that, because in a way, what Sarah was talking about in terms of the production of the domestic, it's a form of knowledge that's being produced in the process. And then also the idea of the possessive logic, you know, the expression of the self through possession, and then that kind of fantasy of being completely self-possessed and in complete control of yourself, which is also a vantage point from which we are criticizing the white fragility position. But Mark, some comments from your side?
I think I find it interesting that you focus on consumption as an important aspect, because that is clearly, of course, what we are seeing in cultural figurations and cultural production and the cultural industries especially, right? So in this chapter, I focused deliberately on the James Bond franchise because it's still one of the biggest, financially very important cultural franchises where fiction and also people's emotional investment in these fictions come together, and where we can clearly see that certain notions of identity, whether it's British national identity, whether it's a certain kind of class identity, kind of historical identity, and especially a white identity, is being consumed, right? It's a matter of consumption. It's a very money-heavy thing, right? When you use another actor to embody James Bond and to embody the history and whatever its traces are in the present, it becomes a financial thing. It becomes an ideological thing as well. So how this character, this figure is consumed in the cultural industry by the audiences matters in so many ways, right? And this is tied in with whiteness, with the history of imperialism and so on. At the same time, of course, consumption in the wider context of neoliberalism and capitalism is interesting when it comes to hyper visibility of certain types of whiteness, right? So white trash, for example, has become in the present rather than in the past of antebellum America. It has become this marker of hyper visible whiteness that liberal whiteness wants to distance itself from, right? So, but at the same time, the hyper visibility of this tainted whiteness overshadows class dynamics, right? So it becomes a matter of whiteness, of a failed whiteness, of a failed being the good liberal white subject, and thereby questions of class and thereby questions of exploitation and inequality, material and economic inequality are being concealed with this element of whiteness and race, right? And that is the case for, you know, white trash in inverted commas in empirical reality, in social reality, but also in how it is being portrayed in contemporary cultural fictions as well.
Thanks. Sarah, do you want to come in at this point?
Yeah, I could. I mean, I think a lot of what Mark has been saying very nicely ties in with my key points. And this, I really like this idea of the desire to be in the world and to be accepted in the world as a white subject that takes the shape of so many minute and tiny homemaking practices. And it's interesting that, as I already implied, you know, a lot of these shows that I looked at, property TV, DIY, home improvement, tidying up with Marie Kondo, which was a huge hit on Netflix, is about becoming a more self-possessive, in control subject by taking control and externalizing that control of yourself onto your external environment, which is your home. How to fold a shirt, how to have a neat cupboard, how to entertain guests nicely, colors to tone down your stressful life. All of that comes into that, that need to not be a failing liberal subject, to not fail at being a good white person, to be a good white middle-class person. And there are, again, interesting margins to that. On the one hand, the failed citizens of the home improvement shows who are helped by the experts. But what I found increasingly interesting is also the movement of, one could say, the other margin of that, in people saying that the white liberal subject consumes too much and therefore we should reduce. For example, in the tiny house movement, we consume too much. Our life is not sustainable. So these people in their Twitter feeds and in their TikToks and whatever, and their YouTube channels, they present this sense of, I'm an even better white subject because I don't consume that much. I have reduced my life into this tiny house, yet this tiny house is super tidy. And it's very nice and it's absolutely bright. And I've produced that myself. All of these videos, I have a very strange addiction to these videos, which say, 2 years of home renovation in 10 minutes. And it gives you that sense of, this is what we did with our own hands and it's sustainable. And this is a good home that we created for ourselves. So that sense of that connection between citizenship, self-possession, ownership, and property, I find that really interesting when it comes to the discourse of being a good white subject and all of its representations of failing citizens, failing white subjects who are not able to maintain both themselves and their home, which kind of are mapped onto each other. The home is an externalization of that. And MTV did have, a few years ago, did have an interesting show which took that to its extremes, which was called Room Raiders, where a girl was asked to visit 3 rooms of boys, and only based on how the rooms look, she had to make a choice about whom to date. That radically externalized that idea that our rooms are an externalization of ourselves. And I find that connection really interesting.
Thanks. Yes, you'll come in maybe if you wanted to add some of what you wanted to say earlier, which you don't have time for.
Actually, it might work to do that at the end. Okay. So, this isn't directly related to the handbook. Can I just say thank you as well, Liz, just for the reflections and the reading and the engagement. It's really interesting, to kind of learn about what you do through other people too. So thank you. But yeah, this consumptive dynamic, as you were asking the question, and then as Mark and Sarah, you were both talking, I was thinking about the consumptive dynamic of whiteness in relation to activism, and this kind of connects to the charitainment stuff. It also connects potentially to the antebellum South kind of points that you were alluding to there. And I'm thinking there about the ways in which white liberal forms of activism enacted kind of in the media, all sorts of other kind of contexts, are actually forms of consumption of the energies of Black activisms often. And Noémie Michel writes really, really brilliantly about this set of dynamics in relation to anti-racist activism in the Swiss context at the moment. I just wanted to raise that, and I think that I'm trying to think, does anybody really write directly about that in the handbook? Maybe not, but the dynamics of consumption between whiteness and Blackness and how that constitutes an enactment of whiteness directly in spaces where we are racialized together and doing those racializations via our activisms, or whether it be online or what have you. She talks about charitainment and the consumptive dynamics there and the energies that are being used and consumed by whiteness to actually reproduce itself through this activism, and the depletion then of the other forms of kind of activist. It relates to a lot of the themes in the book rather than reflects on the chapters. So before the current, and I think it relates to a lot of the points that have been raised, before the current historical juncture in which anti-racist struggles have forced the white supremacist underbelly of liberalism to the surface In retaliatory defense of whiteness, a white person in the global north could go about their whole life almost never having any sort of obvious racially ontological disturbance. In the global southern context, as in South Africa, that is not possible. The embodiedness of the white subject is not deniable. Even if her quest is to combat racism and live an ethical life, she still cannot disinvest from whiteness. Instead, like what Samantha Weiss, and Samantha writes in the volume, and in her previous work in 2010, she wrote an article that produced all sorts of controversies in the South African context and more broadly, but is grappling with, she needs to learn to live through it as a human. This is where connecting the global dots is fundamental, because the repression constitutive of whiteness is no longer possible. Whiteness here is related to whiteness there, as Aliwalia in this volume shows at the subjective level. This is a lesson from the volume as a whole. So that was where I was going to end, and I think it draws together the activism aspect of this, maybe in another sort of way.
Right, wonderful. Thanks, Ulf.
I could go on listening to you for another hour, but I think we're also grateful for the opportunity to take the next or last 20 minutes to raise some questions, have some comments. So whoever likes to join us, and Rüdiger will take care of the audience on the screen. And of course, I'm tempted to comment on James Bond and Idris Elba. You may have seen that he was casted and that you can find the clips on YouTube. And it's really fantastic.
I wasn't aware of that.
No. And all the other ones as well.
Right.
The 5, 6 guys. Yeah, so floor is open. Who would like to start? Please.
First of all, thank you very much. This is really interesting and entertaining also. I have a question for Shona and Christi. I really like the way you emphasize that that whiteness is rooted in liberalism, and that liberalism requires racialization. And I also know this is an ongoing controversy, but I would like to know your take on how much, difficult phrasing, more foundational race and whiteness is than gender and class and other. And obviously this is intersectional and everything, but I have the feeling in the history of liberalism that race is something that is, again, difficult phrasing, much more profound and significant than other differences that are also connected to bodies.
We take it one by one, or yeah.
Thanks for the presentation. It looks fascinating. I'm dying to read it and publish this chapter. Look at the table of contents now. I just have a query or a pondering concerning the periodization. I couldn't help myself, so I went to look up what Jesus looked like originally. Of course, he wasn't blonde and blue-eyed. And the Royal Archaeological Society once did a rendering which looks like this, roughly. That was on the BBC. Now, the point I'm asking is, and it's a sentence actually which is on the table in the book on transregional studies. Marshall Hodgson says, Western Greece is in the west, but Byzantium was in the east. If you notice depictions of Jesus, say in the Hagia Sophia in the 5th century, he would be black-haired, sort of rather non-white in that sense. I would assume that the bones of St. Mark, which are in St. Mark's Square in Venice, stolen from Egypt in the Middle Ages, would probably be that type of person. My question is this only something that starts in the 17th century? And is it not something of Western Europe differentiating itself, even within a European context? Certainly when one thinks of the Balkans as the Schwarzes, long before colonialization, which is, you mentioned Goa, so it's the 17th century. My thinking is that this need to differentiate yourself as a Western European, wherever blue eyes and blonde come from, would go far back.
Yeah, I think that was a mind-blowing presentation. Of course, it's a struggle to hear the voices of authors and then look at the table of contents and being able to speak on the basis of this, but so I have a few remarks and try to organize them a little bit. I find it very convincing how you spoke about the plurality of whiteness, so pluralizing and looking at the multiple whitenesses in the plural. But I was wondering, also listening to the different chapter authors, if you have ever thought about a kind of typology of these whitenesses, also with regards to time and space. So, you know, periodizing whiteness, so this connects definitely to Pilar's comment. Is there a chronology of different whitenesses that you could would construct on the basis also of your material, also with regard to the spatiality of whiteness? Obviously, whiteness works and functions in different times and places differently. As an historian of Eastern Europe, this is the region I see it seems to be missing, and that would be the perfect region to address exactly these complexities that you've been talking about. So you have a whole range of hierarchies of whitenesses in the region, interlinked to coloniality and experience of empire and decolonization. You have narratives of, you know, being the better whites in the context of the Cold War. Exactly because they were the better whites, they would be non-racial and anti-racial, which then in the 1980s is turned around by making exactly the argument that because there was so much alliances with non-white, non-European actors, the region has been contaminated and has become, so to say, white Negroes and has been marginalized in white Europe. So there's a whole complex story behind this, in which you could play with these temporalities and spatialities. I was wondering, what is the reason that Eastern Europe is not on the plate? Or have you been in touch with scholars in this direction? And related to this, also, so the question, the scope of the book, which is impressive and tremendous, and of course, it's always easy to say, okay, we want more, and you need to expand the scope. I was wondering, which chapter would I need to read in order also to learn more about approaches to provincialize whiteness? So from non-European, non-white voices, only from the table of contents, it seemed to me that you have been working with scholars who would look at experiences of being victimized by whiteness or resisting whiteness, but I was wondering which chapters would also talk about the co-production of different kinds of whitenesses from outside whiteness.
You have 1 more minute to think about it. We take one last question. What is?
It's only a reading experience. I would like to add to the questions. Some scholars in German studies coming from Africa, Cameroon, etc., read texts of late 18th century German high-level literature against the grain, and discovered that it is not clear if Antigone is black or white. So there is obviously not that clear connectivity between a liberal, you call it world system, so it seems that is the Wallersteinian version of world system theory and modernity thing, and the artifacts we have even from the 18th century, and then we can go back, etc. So to what extent does that puzzle, destroy, disturb the unilinearity of this connection? There is whiteness invented somewhere, and then it goes on. Yeah, so the black James Bond was invented by Schiller. That would be the argument then.
I guess the first were for Shona and Mark.
Right. Well, what I might do is I'll do my answer and hopefully you'll fill in the bits that I'm leaving out, because I thought there might be some that you might deal better with. I think 3 of the questions, the Eastern European thing, I'm trying to think who else did we ask and what did happen there. Maybe you've got...
Well, the thing is, obviously, when you're trying to put together a handbook, you're throwing the net as wide as possible. We were definitely, we were very intentional in that, but we actually found quite a bit of difficulty in finding people from outside of the usual kind of,
fields, wasn't it?
Geographical areas. And since I've been here, in fact, I've been thinking that one can write a fantastic, probably book, on understanding, just looking at whitenesses within Germany. If you think of the positioning from many conversations now that I've had with people here around, almost like that East German, if you read it through a whiteness lens, East Germanness is almost like a lesser form of whiteness, and that the West Germans came and almost saved the East Germans. And what you've now also further said in your question, around that was actually interaction with African states and so on, the links that were between the Soviet bloc and liberation movements in African states, for example, and so on, that was seen as almost as a stigmatizing link, So that's even something that I wasn't even aware of. So I think the opportunity is right in front of you to write a fantastic analysis of whiteness in the German context. I've also noticed, I have to say, with some of the whiteness work being done in Germany, frequently there's a looking outside of Europe. And actually generally also with European whiteness scholars, they're looking outside of Europe. And we were trying to steer some of our European scholars to actually look inside more. So of course, I think Sarah's work actually also speaks to European constructions of whiteness through consumption, and definitely also Mark's work, without perhaps being explicit, or maybe that's part of the functionality of European whiteness, that one sort of invisibilizes it in that moment. But definitely that was one way for us to try and address the question of European whiteness. Yeah. But I think you can definitely do a fantastic piece of work on German, just looking at Germany and German whitenesses over the past 40 years could be really very powerful work. It's almost like there's a kind of a focus on settler states, which of course where it is much more glaring, but it's for me and actually more interesting in these kinds of spaces. So.
Yeah, I mean, you've reminded me of what I was trying to grasp actually in relation to, I'll come on to the other questions because I don't want to leave them, but I've got a single answer for one and then I don't know whether it relates to the others. But actually, I think one of the other things is worth talking about in terms of the process actually of editing and the intention process that we had in terms of how people actually understand the field of critical whiteness studies, how people are engaging with the idea of engaging with whiteness, regardless of how we might have presented that and we did give people an awful lot of information about kind of the perspective that we were developing and that we were seeking to develop, and why we were inviting people from outside of what might be considered that space. So I think, I mean, I'm trying to think, we definitely invited people who were located in the English context around, who were writing around Eastern Europeanness, various permutations, the relation between all sorts of aspects of whiteness, of race, raciology, so I don't know whether part of it actually, and it might be even interesting to go back and look at our notes and stuff, because this does tell us something, I think, about the critique and the kind of I don't even want to say the binds. I mean, I don't know whether you're more friendly than me. I mean, I think I'm very unfriendly to whiteness studies, really, which sounds ridiculous. But anyway, I think that's all bound up in there. I think I'll just very quickly,
just a question of Goa. I mean, Goa is, should one read that as the starting? Because you are more affined with.
Well, that was what I was going to say. So. I mean, I don't know whether this is going to chime with your view, so you might have to say, well, I don't feel like that, Shona. But the thing about periodization for me, the quick overarching response to the three questions that related to either periodization, bodies, liberalism, like what is the linearity that we're understanding in these things? I don't necessarily think I think, and I've written here, I hope it works now, whiteness is our current expression of coloniality and imperialism. So I think the comment and the engagement is coming from where I am now, or where we are now. Analysis of linearity is something that is actually part of the function of whiteness in a way. So I don't know whether that makes sense. That's the best I can do with the three ways people were coming at that question in a minuscule response. I think it actually relates to the question of intersectionality, if I were to think about. So for me, somebody like Winter's work has been so important for really. So again, actually, I would privilege I think I would privilege these things, but they intersect clearly. But then intersectionality is a note, blah, blah, blah. These terms are so abused, really, in terms of how we use them, how we engage with them, then how we apply them, then the way we talk about them in these sorts of contexts. So actually, that's all I want to say, I think, because I feel like I've said a lot.
But there is something before whiteness.
Oh my!
It's really interesting.
Maybe to briefly add to that, because it also ties in with the spatialization and how spatialization intersects with the periodization, right? Sarah and I have done a lot of work on the whiteness of the Irish, right, throughout history. And there is this book by Noel Ignatieff called How the Irish Became White, right, which is a provocative title in itself because it implies that the Irish have not always been white, right? And the argument behind this and the historical observation behind this is that the Irish, in the context of English colonization, they were not considered white, and the English went out of their way to make claims about how the skull shape of the Irish was closer to African skulls than to the Anglo-Saxon skulls, right? But the Irish gradually became white throughout history, depending on the spatial context and the geographical context. So when in the Caribbean colonies, Irish convicts were, working alongside Black slaves, the English realized that they might have too much power, right? The Irish could get into a coalition with the Black slaves and overthrow the colonizers. So they basically granted them a more privileged racial status, and thereby the Irish gradually became more white in a way in that racial hierarchy. Then fast forward to the Americas, the United States, the Irish were very anxious about the abolition of slavery in the 19th century because they feared, in the South especially, that they would lose their privileged status and that they would be back to square one when it comes to suffering, exclusion and abuse and so on. So they were not really keen on abolishing slavery at all. Then fast forward to the 20th and 21st century, Irish identity in America becomes something that is somehow a marked identity, right? And a lot of white people in America scramble in their family histories to find some trace of Irishness in that, so they can claim a kind of white ethnicity that makes them something special and marked in some way. There is this awkward music video by the white rapper Macklemore, where he basically tells the story of his Irish ancestry and how his forefathers fought against the colonizers. And this white rapper then is waving the Irish flag, and he claims this history of oppression for him, even though he's never been to Ireland, right? Let alone being colonized himself by the English. Here you can see how periodization and spatiality are very, very complex matters when it comes to how different groups were perceived as white or less white in different moments in history.
Thank you. Sarah, can take your comment on some of the questions?
Yeah, I mean, about the typology of whitenesses, I think it's always problematic to talk about typology because typology, specifically in the racial sciences in the 19th century, it was being fairly essentialized, or not fairly. It was straightforward essentialism, which created typologies, and as Mark has just outlined, there are these ideas of lesser whites and ambivalently whites, white people, etc. So I would be also looking at the type of materials that most of us have worked with in the handbook. This is more about the frictions and ambiguities within different forms of whitenesses, rather than creating a sense of typology or linearity. And I completely agree with Shona's comment on linearity being part of the epistemology of whiteness in the first place, because we tend to think about Western history, for example, as linear in terms of increasing development. We talk about arrested development. There are these ideas that some cultures have not progressed as much as others. So that sense of linearity type, is very often mapped onto civilization, and civilization is very often mapped onto specific ideas about whiteness in not only in colonial but also in Western European societies. I feel very uncomfortable talking about a typology of whiteness, and I don't think that the handbook does that or even attempted to do that, to create a typology of whiteness. but rather basically making the point that context is everything, and that without context, we cannot really make sense of what whitenesses can mean within different spaces, in different historical eras, but also for different people. And this is very much what I attempted to point out in my chapter on home and homemaking practices. Even home itself is not a safe space for everyone. It's not available for everyone. It's not safe for everyone. It's not comfortable for everyone. And it's not even something that every one of us wants to achieve in the first place. So all of that is about ambiguities and frictions rather than typologies, I would say.
Quick input from my side. So if the Arun Saldana chapter is actually very interesting because it's almost like a prehistory of race or a prehistory of whiteness that one can read about there. And basically, the idea is that there's very much a material dimension to it. It's about affluence that's measured according to certain objects, and then the bodies that go with those objects are eventually the bodies that become to be viewed as white. So it's basically, so that materialist dimension is very important. It is very much about a position of affluence, which then is associated with, particularly when it comes to white women, of course, not laboring, not working. So tension between leisure and labor, who works and who does not need to work. And then if one traces it further back to, of course, or not even further back to in that period also, questions of slavery, we can trace back racism to the system of slavery, but also particularly how it positioned certain bodies. So racialized bodies, darker bodies that were owned by others. For me, this also links into the question of whiteness as a possessive position. So your ability to, you've got ownership over yourself, you're not owned by another. The people who were owned by others were people who were racialized eventually as Black. So, yeah. Ordering of things. Yeah, and that becomes in an ordering. There's interesting work being done now on one could say, this kind of prehistory of race. And Arun Saldana's work is part of that trying to make sense. But there's an attachment of certain objects with certain bodies. Yeah. But the other thing, I mean, something is, because we also use the work of Dimitri Erasmus, for example, and she talks about the fact that the idea of social constructionism can make you blind actually to the embodied aspect of whiteness. And she talks about the look, the fact that we are basically deciding the race of people in relation to what we actually, in terms of embodiment, in terms of how we're reading their bodies. We're reading race off bodies. And there it can be something as crude as certain bodies are more in the sun because of labor, because of being enslaved, etc., etc. And bodies that are out of the sun that become, in a sense, almost bleached because of this not being in the sun, literally. If you think of something like the whole idea of a blue blood, being an elevated person. Why is that? Where does it come from? It's literally
material practices.
You know, on my skin, in fact, one can see it. So, so those kinds of the embodiedness actually of race that grants you a certain kind of status based on what's being actually read off of who how you actually appear in the world. And then, but I think more work needs to be done in that sense. But it does pose an interesting question, of course. Yeah. Is liberalism then central here? Because that would suggest no. But there's materialism, material possession, material affluence is definitely central to the position, and up until to this day.
Can I maybe come in actually and just I know you said not, but the liberalism, but this thing about liberalism is important. And that was why I was talking about our current vantage point in a way, and the hour being the global coloniality of whiteness that we, so the we is a very intentioned, not thinking we're all coming from the same position within that, but understanding the globality of that kind of point of view for the now. I've totally lost what I was. Yeah, but liberalism is the way in which we understand or we frame or we articulate particular practices of embodiment, power, and imperialism, really. So it's not about liberalism as being a starting point or center. That's the language out of which and this is the point that Winter can help us.
So fascinating debate. Thank you, Christi, for organizing that. The lovely thing about a book launch is that it's the pre-event for planning the next volume. And I guess we have an opportunity now to get some drinks and food and talk you through your next handbook. Thank you so much for being with us, for coming. Thank you, Sarah, for joining us from Vienna. And thank you for joining us.